Remember dedication nights? I may be giving away my age a little bit here, but I'd like to send this next episode out to all the first year teachers. It's August, and so many of you are really excited to start your own classrooms this year, and I get it. And I wish you the absolute best. And so in light of that, I asked my guest for this episode what her one directive, her one main piece of advice would be for you brand new teachers out there.
To be your true self. Oftentimes, teachers are afraid, and teachers are, they come in afraid to be their natural self because their education department tells them, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, go with your gut.
That's Kiera Vargas. And I kind of met her in a roundabout way. I didn't wake up this morning thinking I would be producing a podcast, but I watched a video that she had, a video interview on the Strobel Summit with Kim Strobel. And I was completely taken by her message. And so I emailed her and asked her if she would be willing to be on this podcast. It's kind of a back to school special. And, if we're really gearing up toward how we can make it right with kids from the beginning. And she immediately replied and said, yes, absolutely. And I said, what time would you be available? And she said, how about this afternoon? And I'm like, sure. Yes, let's do it. So
my name is Kiera Vargas. I consider myself an educator. I'm also a librarian. I'm also a lawyer, and I've been teaching for about 15 years. I've taught courses. Well, I've taught every grade from K-6 to college seniors.
Wow.
One of the biggest components that I believe in within teaching is nurturing our students. So I've always been known to be that nurturing, compassionate teacher that I love just to promote positivity for our kids.
So you have 2 masters, is that right?
I do. I have a master's in English education, and I have a master's in library and information sciences, and I also hold a JD.
And you're part of the American Bar Association.
I am, along with the American Library Association.
So you are a very credentialed person. Do you ever get people asking the question, why are you teaching? That question infuriates me, but do you ever get that?
I do. And, it really annoyed me, to be honest with you, especially I won Teacher of the Year last year in Madison County, Florida. And I remember during my interview, one of the ladies, her question was, well, if you have all of this, why are you just teaching? And I don't look at it as just teaching. So
why do you teach?
I love it. I love engaging with the students. I feel like teachers, we are so important. We get to pull out the best. We get to push our students to be their best.
Mm-hmm. What was your relationship with your teachers when you were at the age of your students?
So I remember when I was in 8th grade, I went to Huntington Middle School in Newport News, Virginia. And this was the very first year. And it could have been the second year, but I know this was a monumental year for me because I had my first Black male teachers. I can't remember having any male teachers until that year. And that year, those males, my band director, Mr. Braxton, my civics teacher, who was my homeroom teacher, Mr. Frazier, and my English teacher, Mr. Fenwick. We also had a Black male principal, Mr. Klein. And that year was so, it was like a turning point for me because I saw how much they cared. And at that time, I don't think I realized it, but it really did something to me. Like instead of us getting into trouble and a teacher, writing students up, I remember my teacher, Mr. Frazier, he's now I think he's a principal somewhere in Newport News, Virginia, but he had us listen to Les Brown. I remember Mr. Fenwick, he was our English teacher. he introduced us to Black literature. He introduced many of the kids in my class who never heard of Kwanzaa. He introduced them to Kwanzaa. He showed us that we are, as a Black group of kids, that we were really important.
And you had never felt that before?
I never felt that before, because I also remember, and I guess it was in my 6th grade year. I do remember my language arts teacher, she read to us "I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings" by Maya Angelou. So I do remember then, but it was just different. It was completely different, because it could have been like most of my classmates, we didn't really see the Black male in a positive light. So maybe that was the reason why it was such a turning point for us too. We saw Black educated men, and we saw their passion for educating us.
And it sounds like they were able to build those relationships with you, their students. And that was a turning point for you.
It was. Coach Frazier, Mr. Frazier, my civics teacher, was actually my track coach throughout my high school years in some form or fashion. And Mr. Braxton later became a high school band director, and I was his drum major my senior year in high school. So, I was able to continue building relationships with them. And it was so great, because you could see that they truly cared.
Mm-hmm. And so now part of your mission as an educator is to help other educators see the value of relationships. Is that right?
Yes.
So when you say, or when educators say, build relationships with your students, like, what does that mean? Like, what is it? I could see it going from anywhere from knowing your kids' names, right, to knowing their names and all their siblings. And I don't know, what is a relationship to you?
A relationship has to be something that's genuine. So it can't be anything that's forced. And with each student, each year, my relationship practices, they change. It also depends on the type of school that you're at. I know when I started teaching in 2004. I was at a military academy. From there, I went to an alternative school. 10 years or so plus more. Last year in Madison, Florida, and I'm just thinking, because Madison, and I just finished teaching at a DoDEA school here at Fort Knox, Kentucky. But Madison, Florida, I had students from, they were just amazing students. But because it was a cultural difference for me, because I never lived in Florida, I had to take the time to get to know those students. And to do that, I would sit outside during lunch. So instead of me going to the teacher lounge, instead of me eating lunch by myself, I would go outside and I would watch the students. I would see who they interacted with. I would see what they did. So whether they were on their cell phones, whether they were by themselves, whether they were reading, and it allowed me a chance to get to know the students. And after being there, throughout the school year, I had students to come and sit with me. They would actually pay attention to what I was doing too. So if I was reading a book, for example, I got into manga last year. And so I was reading the series Death Note. And
okay.
and the students were so excited, like, oh my gosh, you're reading Death Note. And I'm like, oh man, I'm pretty popular now. Like, I'm reading Death Note. And right. I wound up going to purchase the entire series. And at one point, they were rushing me to finish the books, because they're like, I told them, I say, well, you can't get the book until I finish it. And throughout the school year, my books were passed around and they were returned to me. But there were students who, some teachers would probably never even think that they would read, because, they didn't take the time to see what type of books the students wanted to read. relationship. So that's one example. Another example would be, I had a couple of football players and basketball players I had handshakes with. So they would come into the class and we would have we would do our handshake. I remember I had one baby girl. She was a discipline problem at the very beginning, but I realized she just needed some love. And I would tell her every single day, and I meant it, and I still mean it with all my heart, I love you. And I would say her name after the end. I had another student, he would put his head down, and I realized that possibly he was seeking attention. So every day, once I got my class started, I would go to him and I would call him by his name and I would tell him, stand up. We have to hug each other. And we would hug in the middle of class. So, it has to be like every single day. And I remember one time I forgot to hug him and he just looked at me and I'm like, I have to give you a hug. And every day he would act like he didn't want to hug me. So, relationship building, it has to be genuine, but you have to study your students. So I think the same way we as teachers, we go into educational course classes and we study the pedagogy of teaching. We have to also study our students. We can't go into a classroom and expect every student to be the same. And I think that's one of the myths about education, particularly even when you're looking at standardized tests. We're expecting these students to all be on the same level. And to do that, you're really personalizing curriculum per student, even if they are in the same grade level.
Right. So it seems like there's a lot of focus these days on building relationships with students that I don't think was there when I was in school, and I'm older than you are. So back in the day, let's just say my teachers weren't focused on that. Why do you think it's more important, or there's a greater focus now?
Students have so much more to deal with. A few years ago, I'm not sure if you are familiar with North Carolina A&T State University, but it's a historical Black college university. And one of the historical piece that A&T is recognized for is the Greensboro Four, a group of four men who assisted with the sit-in movement. And I was privileged to have one of them come speak in my class, probably, I think it was maybe 2009, 2010. And he shared with my students during this time that they have bigger issues than he had, even though they were race relation issues. And I was really surprised. And what he shared was the technology now. Technology is so overwhelming. And you think now, this is 8-9 years ago from when he said this, students have technology issues. Students have, they just have so much more. And so as teachers, as parents, as, it's just good-hearted people, it's our job to take the time to build these relationships to hear our students out.
So then it seems like education there are two camps where there's the standardized testing, we need to teach content. And then there's the camp of education that's more, first we need to reach the students. So that the content people are like, all that's kind of, frou-frou, all this soft stuff that we shouldn't have to deal with. Right. And then the other side is like, well, but first we need to reach the kids before we can even, help them with content. If that makes any sense.
Oh, it does. I'm a firm believer of that. I was often asked, how was I able to get students to pass standardized tests? And I've never focused on the test. It's about building, and, we talked about this briefly, building that self-efficacy, which is part of relationship building, getting to know your students, getting to know what they like, getting to know what motivates them. And once you do that, the student is going to do anything that you want them to do. because they believe in themselves. And many of our students, they come into the classroom broken. They come into the classroom broken, maybe because of former teachers, maybe because of what's going on in their home life. So that's another reason why it's important to build relationships so you can understand what's going on with in their home. Again, one of the things that I have done, and I can say that I've done this every year that I've taught K-12, I've visited the communities that I've taught in. And it's not I'm, walking or canvassing, like I drive around. I go to the local stores. Students that are working, learn where they're working, and I may go to that restaurant that they're working, or I may go to that grocery store that they're working, or, wherever it is that they're working. I try to, just kind of get a feel of what they're going through.
Yeah. And so not only are you building relationships necessarily with your students in the classroom setting, this is going, my brain's going a couple different places here, but you're also building relationships with their outside of the school, like what their life entails outside of the school, right? So like where they're working, or, where they hang out together, or that kind of thing. And so but then you're also building,
I'm sorry.
You're also being seen in the community. And I think that's probably something that's not always done with intention, right? Unless the teacher lives in the community and frequents the same places just naturally that their students do, that's not going to happen. Right. So I think that's something that is good for teachers, I think, as a doable, actionable item on how to build relationships. However, I know that so many teachers that I worked with, you go down to lunch, teacher lunch, which is like 20 minutes, right, in the teacher lounge. And they'd be like, this is my time. I have to have this. And they were just absolutely not willing to give that up and go sit outside like you did, or, invite kids to eat with them in their classroom like I know other teachers do, or sit in the cafeteria or whatever. And I don't know, what's your take on that?
It prevents the teachers from getting to know the students, but it also prevents the students from getting to know the teachers. And I think that we have this false perception that as teachers, we can't be vulnerable to the students. They're trusting us to teach them, and they do want to get to know who we are. They do want to know that, they have people that truly care about them in the classroom versus, and, as a teacher, that there's some bad teachers, just like they're bad lawyers, they're bad police officers, there's some bad teachers that, one of the reasons why I never go into teacher lounges is because, that, the first thing you're taught, like, don't go into the teacher lounge. They're going to talk about the kids. But, seriously, those are the teachers that, I feel like they're doing a disservice in our profession. And, if you're there, if you're in a schoolhouse, I get it. We all need that mental health break. We do become exhausted with teaching, but that's what planning is for. That's where, you walk away for a second, but I don't think that it's hard to, even if it's 1 or 2 times out the week, to just go sit in the cafeteria with the student, to even go to the library during your lunch. I know a lot of libraries, they open up where students can play games. They're playing chess or they're playing checkers, just walking around the hallway. But there's so many ways that you can build relationships. And I think I'm kind of segueing off your question, but yes.
No,
relationship building, I think is the most important thing with teaching, because you're building that foundation, and students aren't going to work hard for you if they don't see that you truly care. And, again, students they understand. I've taught, like I said, every grade from 6th to college seniors, but just over the last 2 years, I taught high school students, and they know who care and they know who don't care. I recently had a student, who sent me a message just to tell me how much he loved me and how much I impacted him and his classmates. He's on his way to the Air Force. I had another student that sent me a very similar message. So, they really know who genuinely cares, and it's all about taking the time to get to know them.
Mm-hmm. And I bet if we all were to think back to our educational career and the teachers that first pop into our mind, mm-hmm. It's not what they taught us. It's something we did on the side or an extracurricular where you got to know them on a more personal level, that kind of thing.
Yes. I have a question for you.
Okay.
What subject did you teach, or do you teach?
I taught 7th grade science and language arts.
Okay. So you think about this, like in 7th grade, I honestly don't remember what courses I taught. I mean, what courses I took. And, in 8th grade, like I said, I remember the teachers and the courses that they taught, but I don't necessarily remember much from those classes. And I think that's what, as teachers, we fail to realize that the subject, the content is great, but, those meaningful relationships are even more powerful.
Well, and like you said, your 8th grade year with mm-hmm. your teachers was pivotal for you. For me, it was my 7th grade year with my science teacher. She took the time to get to know me as a person. There was this little greenhouse that we had, and I would go up to her room after I ate lunch and get the key to the greenhouse, and I would go, all they had in there was geraniums, but I would go in there. I was the only one allowed in there, but like, that was my thing. And she understood that. And to this day, that attention and that relationship that I built with her, I attribute to me going into education, specifically 7th grade, because that junior high was so hard for me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I think we all have those teachers. And even back in the day when relationships weren't a focus for teachers, those that did it innately, I think were the most successful.
I agree.
So yeah, we're now friends on Facebook, and I've mentioned to her how much I appreciate her. So that's, that's cool. Okay, so that totally got me off topic here.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good.
We have had a really great conversation.
Right. You've talked about several ways that you've developed relationships with your students and responses that you've gotten, and, how much they've appreciated that. What would you say, as we kind of wrap this up here, if there's anybody going, like, this is going to be their first year, like 2019-20 is going to be their first year in their first classroom, what would you say to them?
To be your true self. Oftentimes, teachers are afraid, and teachers
Amen.
are, they come in afraid to be their natural self because their education department tells them, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, go with your gut. If mm-hmm. you see that a student might need additional assistance and stuff, take the time to get to know them. If you see that, I shared a story, my first year teaching, I noticed that I had a student that their personal hygiene was not up to par. So I took that student to the side and I actually purchased them personal hygiene stuff. And I also contacted their parents to let their parent know. And I also shared it with my principal. So, don't feel as if you have to be restricted. Like, you can't touch your student. You can't, hold side conversations, as long as you're being natural about it. I mean, genuine about it, natural too. It's okay. It's mm-hmm. okay. Do it with good intention.
Well, and I think we've touched on very briefly about us as teachers being vulnerable mm-hmm. to our kids. Mm-hmm. We expect them to, maybe in their journal prompt or whatever, to be vulnerable. But then when we're not reciprocating, I think that builds a barrier.
It does. It does. And that is part of relationship building. I would always tell stories about my life. And, you don't have to be so transparent that you're telling the student everything about your life, but students want to, again, get to know you. So the last 2 years were very interesting for me, too, because I have a teenage son who attended both of the schools that I taught. And this past year, he was in my class. And probably for the first 2 or 3 months, the students had no idea he was my son. And once they realized that he was my son, they saw that I treated them the same way I treated my own son.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and so I think teachers, and I just want to reiterate and emphasize this point that relationship building is not just the teacher learning about the kids.
No.
It's a two-way street.
It is.
Just like in personal relationships with your significant other, you need to learn about each other and be vulnerable to each other. Mm-hmm. And so I think I hear you saying that we need to be vulnerable as well. Not totally transparent.
Right,
I mean, there is the adult student divide, right? Boundaries. But letting them in to us, I think, is important as well.
And, one of the things, too, I'm sorry, but modeling for your students. So I was a language arts English teacher. So when my students did journals, I would actually sometimes do journals with them. And I would share my journal with them. We may have about 10 minutes to do journal prompts and then maybe discuss them. And, oftentimes you may have those students that are kind of, bashful. They don't really want to share what their prompt was. And, it's a way to just kind of get them to just start thinking and just, it was an initial assignment that I've always had when they come to my class. And I would share with them my journal responses. And they were always so in awe with my responses. Even when it came to writing assignments for technology, I would show them that my draft was not that great, because sometimes students think that teachers know everything and they will find, mistakes. Oh, Ms. Vargas, you forgot to put a comma there, or you spelt that word wrong. But again, that's relationship building, allowing the students to see you as imperfect.
Well, but then I can also think of teachers that if a kid had pointed out an error like that, they would get purple in the face and write them up for detention. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Well, Kiera, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for what you do for those kids every day. It sounds like you've made a tremendous impact on a whole lot of kids, and kudos to you for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Matt.
And thanks to you, our listeners, for making this show a success. If you could do me one last favor and get onto iTunes or Google Podcasts or wherever you find your podcasts and give us a rating and a review, that would help more teachers be able to hear our message. I'd also like to thank my bosses, all the people at the regional offices in areas 3, 40, 41, 45, and 50. You guys are the best. We'll see you next time.